Yeah. The labor gathering, so brothers and sisters. It's a distinct honor for me to introduce Margot Canaday, Dottie Professor of History at Princeton University, and to welcome to Wayne State University as part of our reboot, the Fraser Center series, sponsored by the Fraser Center for Workplace Issues, the Center for Gender and Sexuality Studies, and the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program, the History Department, and the Walter P. Reuther Library. Her topic today, drawn from her recent book, Queer Career, Sexuality, and Work in Modern America. Professor Canaday received her doctorate at the University of Minnesota in 2004, and thus followed one of their more famous graduates, named me.
State advisor too.
Strange. And since that time, Margot has been at Princeton University community as both a fellow and also as faculty. Her 2003 article, Building a Straight State, Sexuality and Social Citizenship under the 1944 GI Bill, published in the Journal of American History, was a recipient of the Organization of American Historians Lewis Peltzer Award and the American Historical Association's Jeffrey Sprague Award. And the dissertation on which her first book was based won the Lerner Scott Award for the best dissertation in women's history and the best dissertation from Law and Society. Her first book, The Straight State, Sexuality and Citizenship in 20th Century America, also won several distinguished awards, including the Ellis Hawley Prize from the Organization of American Historians, the Lambda Literary Award, the Gladys Kammerer Award from the American Political Science Association, the Laura Romero Prize from American Studies Association, and the John Boswell Prize from the American Historical Association. And I am actually leaving off quite a few. Professor Canaday also co-edited the recent volume, Intimate States, Gender, Sexuality, and Governments in Modern U.S. History with Nancy Cott and Robert Self. These are really only the headlines. They're also, as many a detective and mystery series would have it, the facts. I suspect those of you who have read Margot Canaday's work know why these honors were bestowed. From my perspective, her work has paved the way for much scholarship that followed, connected our understanding of sexuality to the larger worlds of country and workplace, and opened up new and intimate vistas in our comprehension of the state of law and policy, not only as institutions, but as practices. They have also shed light on the human experience and the experience of being LGBTQ in America. But she moved from her work on the state to study the workplace, where the Fraser Center and I have our focus, pleases me no end. With that, I welcome our guest, Margot.
Professor Bao for that really lovely introduction, and for also the invitation to return to Wayne State. Am I loud enough in the back? Okay, cool. So I spoke here at an early stage in my research, and so it's great to be back here at the end point of what has been a very long process. And also thanks to all of you for making time at what I'm sure is a busy moment in your semester. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk a bit about my new book, which is a history of queer people on the job from the mid-20th century to the present. I'll talk today about why I wrote this book, how I went about it, what I found, what I think the most important interventions are that the book makes. And then I'll close by just reading a brief excerpt to give you a little bit more of a sense of it. But before I do any of that, I'll start by doing something that admittedly I almost never do, which is I'll start by following myself, the advice that I regularly give to graduate students. When you take your work out into the world, I say to them, particularly when interviewing for a job, but really anytime, you should try to have at the ready, not just the elevator pitch description of your overall project, but you really also need at your fingertips a single anecdote, one brief story that really gets at the heart of what you are up to. And your audience will hopefully remember that anecdote, that one story long after you are gone. So my book has a lot of anecdotes in it, it's full of stories, but there's one of these nuggets that I think encapsulates the whole better than anything else. And so let me briefly share that with you, ask you to remember it as I'll come back to it at points throughout the talk. It comes from the very end of the first chapter, a chapter that sets out what I call the straight world of work of the 1950s and 1960s. And there I describe one government economist's experience of learning that her security clearance investigation had revealed her homosexuality, and she was on the brink of being fired from the Treasury Department. And her immediate boss, who was sympathetic to her plight, helped set up an interview for her with some private sector economists whom he knew in New York. She was fortunate that he was willing to help, and also that the New York firm was not looking for someone to do government work. But still, she had a strategy to ensure the needed outcome, and this is critical. She asked her boss to be sure that the prospective employer knew about clearance, meaning about her homosexuality. And this was shrewd on her part. For the New York company, the so-called clearance problem was not an impediment. Rather, it was an opportunity to get a highly skilled economist at a significantly reduced price. They knew the only reason they could hire me was because of that clearance, she recalled. For the economist, the job offer came much more quickly than she had expected, and it was, as she described, an end to my desperation. But it was, she also observed, a much lesser job than otherwise I would have taken. So that's your nugget. Please hold on to that as we go along. So I wrote this book, Queer Career, to address two gaps in the existing historiography. First, the workplace itself is understudied by historians of sexuality, especially when one considers how important work is to the queer past. Not only was fear of job loss probably the greatest fear that queer people had for much of the period that I'm writing about, a fear that very much shaped how queer people moved through the world. But somewhat paradoxically, workplaces sometimes supported queer lives in very particular ways. Gay people found each other on the job, they clustered in certain kinds of work, and some occupations validated the experience of gender nonconformity that was central to at least some queer lives. As one woman who sought mechanical work in the 1950s declared, she always felt happiest when she had a hammer in her hand. Or another man who exalted around the same time that he was a typist and he wanted to type. So against the historiography that has disproportionately focused on nightlife, leisure, I thought the workplace might be worth paying more attention to. And I wanted to do it not by considering a single occupation or a single type of worker, blue collar or white collar, corporate executive, flight attendant, teacher, librarian, or social worker, but rather by trying to paint broad canvas. For me, part of that broad canvas, and here we get to the second historiographic working that I wanted this book to fill, part of that broad canvas had to include women, a group that has also been somewhat neglected in the field of LGBT history. And there are a lot of reasons for this neglect. Some of it comes down to a source problem. Historians of sexuality have leaned heavily on the archival traces of state policing to document the queer past. Those are amazing sources in many ways, but when the state police sexuality, it's usually policing men. My first book about the state's regulation of homosexuality, or first half of the 20th century, is, despite my own deep commitments as a feminist historian, predominantly about male experience for that reason. And so when I started to conceptualize this book, Queer Career, I thought much more deliberately about sites from which to write a queer history that would not marginalize women, And it soon became obvious to me that the workplace could be such a site. After all, lesbian breadwinners needed better, higher paying jobs than married women to survive economically, and they sometimes violated gender norms to obtain them. By necessity, as a team of sociologists concluded in the 1960s, lesbians were seriously committed to work. Okay, so those are some of the reasons why I wrote the book. How did I go about it? I think it was unavoidable that at first my approach was conditioned by the dominant narrative of the lavender scare. To the extent that historians of sexuality hadn't considered gay employment, this has been the primary paradigm, even a kind of shorthand for the mid-20th century. And the lavender scare, of course, refers to the brutal episode when thousands of gay and lesbian civil servants, including the economist with which I began today, were purged from the government. And the economist's surprising survival strategy, a strategy that ultimately involved self-exposure, was not something I knew about when I commenced my research, nor was it really represented in historiography. What was more prevalent was a notion of employers determined to root out the gay people on their staff, and then deep hiding on the job by those employees. And so I began my research assuming that it was likely that gays had tried to vanish on the job, and that digging up the historical evidence would, as a result, be tough going. Determined to try, I began where anyone who was working on the post-war period with little confidence in what the archives would yield would begin, which is I began with oral histories. And because I thought the period before gay liberation would be especially difficult to recover, I began to look specifically for gays and lesbians born in the 1930s and 1940s who were willing to speak with me about their experiences on the job. And their working lives, which spanned the 1950s into the 1990s, also mapped temporally onto the rise and fall of standard employment that I assumed would be central to my story. I conducted my first interviews in 2011. I ended up doing 150 of them all over the country, including several here in Detroit and also in Lansing. Really great conversations. What jumped out at me during those initial conversations was something that I had not expected to hear, which is that more often than I heard stories about elaborate ruses to conceal sexual identity over work. I heard from informants that they assumed that their bosses and their coworkers suspected or even knew about them. And so that degree of visibility and knowability surprised me, and it gave me more confidence to head into the archives. And there I found my lesbian economist, who outed herself to private sector employees or employers, and many other related scraps of evidence. And together, all of this pointed me towards a reconsideration of the lavender scare as our dominant way of thinking about gay employment in the 20th century. So to elaborate on this, it's not that the lavender scare framework is wrong. It's that it applies to a particularly dramatic flashpoint in a particular sector that doesn't fully capture the experience of many gay people at work, even at mid-century. While fear of job loss was a pervasive anxiety during these years, employees handled that fear in a variety of ways. And my research has found that not all gay people, especially those employed in the private sector, were engaged in deep hiding in their jobs, even at mid-century. First of all, there was a queer work world that overlapped with the secondary labor market, populated by women and people of color in low-paid, low-status work, where gay people could be open and where non-normative gender expression was sometimes affirmed on the job. As one informant told me, I was always looking for those low-paying jobs where I could be myself. Many gay people, however, were employed in a straight work world, in relatively better jobs, but in positions that did not affirm their queerness and often repressed it. In the words of another informant, I couldn't wait to leave the office to be who I was. Yet even there, the spectrum ranged from secrecy to discretion, with many employees engaged in what the sociologist Irving Goffman called covering. And covering implied the work of keeping one's stigma from looming large, but it rarely required an elaborate performance. As it turns out, and this is key, many employers were happy to look the other way. Employment relations during these years were in fact regularly characterized by an unspoken bargain. An unspoken bargain between employees and employers. This was a mutual pact to neither reveal nor to pry. So it's obvious, I think, why this arrangement, this bargain, made sense for understandably apprehensive gay employees. But for employers, why look the other way? The appeal of gay workers at mid-century, I argue, can only be understood in contrast to the other workplace bargain that was struck during these years. And this was not the queer bargain, but the straight one that provided male breadwinners with a family wage to support their wives and children in exchange for submission on the job. And as many historians have noted, this was an expensive and burdensome arrangement, but in a booming economy, the stability it brought was for a time worth the price. So in this context then, gay workers were especially valued for their precarity in an age of security. The appeal of gay workers at mid-century was that of a vulnerable labor force, one whose consciousness was shaped by the specter of the government purges and who commonly knew of other queer people who had lost jobs. These workers could be underpaid relative to the level of skill and responsibility their jobs demanded, easily pushed out with downturns in the business cycle, and expected to quietly walk away when fired. They would also stay in jobs where they felt safe, even when they were mistreated. Gay people also brought assets to their jobs that employers recognized and cared about. Because they were perceived as unattached from family units, they were contingent, easy to move, and flexibly employed. As a result, they potentially alleviated some of the pressure of the Fordist breadwinner model at a time when many labor arrangements, as I said, were still expensive, cumbersome, and inflexible. In some, they were harbingers of the post-Fordist transformation of work that was still several decades in the future. And as long as gay employees were discreet and they did not attract negative attention, there were many reasons then for employers to avoid seeing what they didn't want to see. Now, because queerness, in contrast to race, is transversal to class, meaning that queer people do not occupy a single class position, but are distributed throughout class structure. It is sometimes experienced that they have experienced cultural animus, but not economic exploitation. My book takes aim at this assumption, arguing, as one social theorist put it a few years ago, that the liabilities of homosexuals are hardwired into relations of production. Those dynamics were in fact explicitly called out by gay liberationists beginning in the early 1970s. Our bosses know we're gay, but pretend not to notice, one liberationist tract explained, and for that we are profoundly grateful, as we are expected to be. As a result, this writer lamented, gay people perform work that others would not tolerate. Other liberationists took aim specifically at the way the criminalization of sexual behavior and gender transgression outside of the workplace licensed queer vulnerability within it. Yet laws against homosexuality, another liberationist noted, did not prevent homosexuals from being fired, nor were they intended to. What they enabled rather was the systematic exploitation by employers of state-created vulnerabilities. And it's important that even tolerant and understanding employers, such as those economists from New York, benefited from the system of gay labor that these liberationist writers describe. Now, whatever the attitude of various employers toward their employees, however, this bargain that defined employment relations more broadly did begin to break down in the 1970s and the 1980s. As some gay people heeded the liberationist call to reject its terms. That development was enabled first by a terrible economy in which there was simply less to lose, and then by a deadly epidemic that had the same effect. More and more gay people yearned not only to be seen, but to be acknowledged. Outside the workplace, this occurred with alacrity as gay culture exploded across these decades. Inside the workplace, the pace of change was slower. And this had something to do, I argue, with the way that gay people were mostly left out of the civil rights achievements of these years. In contrast to other groups that suffered from discrimination on the job, queer workers gained no underlying blanket protection. And in fact, no other minority group has had so little claim on formal legal protection. That void mattered as employers responded to with increasing animus to employees who were tossing away their former norms of discretion. Historians have focused more on the freeing aspects of these years rather than their overall precariousness, but these elements are, to my eye, inextricably intertwined. Yet even outside the regular mechanisms of formal civil rights law, workplaces partially opened to gay workers, and clear expressions of identity gradually became possible by the end of the 20th century. So how did that happen? One explanation has to do with the distinction we might make between civil rights law and civil rights culture. The civil rights imaginary included gay people, in other words, even if civil rights laws did not. Both the African American freedom struggle and the women's liberation movement affected the rights consciousness of many gay people, changing their sense of what they were entitled to in the workplace. And while this growing rights consciousness did not emerge alongside robust legal tools, this study documents the responsiveness of business to demands that queer employees increasingly made for protection and recognition. Business was out ahead of both the government and also labor unions in protecting and otherwise demonstrating a receptivity to gay workers by the 1990s. I argue in part because of the way these workers were in sync with and had even prefigured the employment regime of late capitalism. So just as the historian Sven Becker recently argued that the emergence of industrial capitalism was built on older social hierarchies, in his case, he's talking about patriarchal relations in the household, a similar claim might be made about the ways in which post-industrialism or post-Fordism was built in part on the economic position of queer people at mid-century. Many attributes that later came to be associated with post-Fordism, short-term precarious work arrangements that enabled employers to shed responsibility for family units, were the ones that, going back as far as the 1950s, could also be identified with gay labor. One could, of course, make a similar argument about women and workers of color, but queer workers were even more predictive because of the way they represented precarity in primary as well as secondary sector jobs. So the corporate office as well as the retail shop, and because of their perceived lack of dependence. And here on the point, I do not claim that queer people were more precarious than women or people of color, and many were, of course, positioned at the intersection of those identities. The point is rather to highlight the ways that gay workers offered capital a mid-century lesson in structuring employment relations without regard to family attachment. Even in primary sector jobs, for which the breadwinner caregiver model was paradigmatic. And relatedly, to note that queer people were among the first precarious workers across the class spectrum. For example, in middle-class jobs, long dominated by white men. In secondary sector employment, long associated with contingent and fragile jobs for women, people of color, and also immigrant workers, we should only notice that queer people were also present there among the precarious. Okay, so having laid all of that out, let me say a bit now about what I think the stakes are of a project like this. So first, as I've already suggested, I'm invested in revising somewhat the place of the lavender scare in the historiography. But I want to be clear that I'm not rejecting its importance or even writing against it. Rather, I'm seeking a way of positioning the lavender scare that does not overgeneralize based on the public sector, but rather relates public and private sector experiences to one another to capture the range of ways that people appeared at work during this period. And again, I return us to that government economist with whom I began and the way that her movement through public and private sectors hints not just at government repression, but also at a labor system that was built up around it. And so this then gets me to a second related intervention. I want to invite us to think less about this job or this sector of industry or that sector of industry, and more about this entire work experience systemically. To think, in other words, about gay labor as a form of labor, something we can talk about in the same systematic way we might talk about women's work or immigrant labor, for example. And the latter example might be especially revealing, as I see particularly interesting parallels between gay and immigrant labor for at least two reasons. First, both types of workers were sometimes viewed as unencumbered by dependence. With queer people, because whatever the reality of their attachments, they often presented as functionally single at work. And with certain immigrant groups, because families were sometimes left behind in sending countries. Second, and as importantly for both groups, the potentially illegal status of the workforce shaped working conditions. Gay people shared with certain immigrant populations, in other words, a presumptive status as illegal persons. And this licensed exploitation and otherwise shadowed their movement through the working world. I find it noteworthy that so many of the jobs that were predominantly gay in the pre-liberation era, think of restaurant kitchens, for example, now often predominantly held by immigrants. And this may be a key to unlocking a mystery then, helping us to think systemically about gay work like immigrant labor, again, as a form of labor. And I make that move, I hope, without plating what are undoubtedly different scales of vulnerability in these communities, but also wanting to be clear about what I see as another key intervention in my work, which is that I'm highlighting the long history of queer vulnerability at work and explicitly taking on the myth of gay affluence that has been so distorting. And while economists have long debunked the notion of gay affluence, it has been difficult to dislodge in the broader culture. And the cultural hold of this idea, of course, has a history. And at least part of that history is featured in my book. So in the midst of the AIDS crisis, after years of getting almost nowhere in advocating for federal protection, some employees in the corporate sector went to their companies to ask for voter protection in recognition. Now, it took some concerted work, but the corporate sector was eventually quite receptive. And so the most meaningful version of gay employment rights initially came not through legal mandates, but through the market. And this, of course, was patchwork protection. It left much of the working class as vulnerable as ever. And the result was that by the end of the 20th century, middle class and wealthy gay people were far more likely to be visible in their jobs than working class and poor queers. And not only did this then bolster the appearance of gay applicants, but it's also a striking reversal, I show, from the mid-20th century, when queer people were far more visible in working class occupations than those in most professional settings dared to be. So I want to recover then this longer arc of precariousness as really central for thinking about gay experience, as well as to highlight the really particular and interesting way that the gay rights movement has also been, in the American context, the most marked social movements. And this then brings me to neoliberalism. One of the things that this book undoubtedly shows is that emancipatory things do sometimes come from the market. As a progressive who truly believes in public sector solutions to our collective problems, I am profoundly ambivalent about that. But even with that ambivalence, I think most of the work that I've read that sets out a relationship between gay rights and neoliberalism offers a powerful critique, but is sometimes under-nuanced in its treatment of history. Under-nuanced in the sense that it minimizes how the turn to business in the late 1980s and early 1990s was about the evaporation of other political possibilities on the ground, as well as how vulnerable many queer people were in their employment across many different sectors at that moment. But I also think the most important historical question is not why queer people turned to the corporation late 1980s, early 1990s. It's really why business responded. And I contend that the answer has a lot to do, circling back to where I've already been, with the way that values long associated with queer workers aligned so perfectly with the demands of late capitalism. So those whom the social theorist Melinda Cooper once called Fordism's non-normative subjects actually became post-Fordism's normative ones. And a position that was once marginal has in some sense become the center. And we should perhaps think of queer workers less as outliers than as harbingers of axial shifts in employment relations across the second half of the 20th century. So I'll just mention one last thing. And this is perhaps less an intervention that my book makes than simply an aspiration, but one that I hold most dear. So in writing this book, I really wanted to inhabit the space that the discipline of history provides at the intersection of the social sciences and the humanities. I wanted to write a book, in other words, that both offered a structural account of gay workers across changing employment regimes in the post-war United States, and an affective labor history that could reveal the workplace as a site where queer people experience not only great vulnerability, but also the deepest kind of meaning. And I've really given you the structural account in the last 25 minutes. And so I think the best way to give you a sense of a more affective mode is to read a short excerpt from the book. The excerpt that I've chosen is from the chapter on employment discrimination during the AIDS crisis, which was really dramatic and startling. Even compared to the Lavender Scare, this is, I believe, the historical nadir of gay employment in the United States. But in a chapter focused on job loss, I also wanted not to lose the disease itself. And one way to do that was to focus on the new kinds of work that emerged as a result of the epidemic. And one central example was in nursing. And so I started the chapter borrowing from the historian Thomas Adams with what he calls a workscape. And the workscape here is the country's first dedicated AIDS ward at San Francisco General Hospital. And I should also add that I was writing this chapter just as the country was shutting down in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic in March of 2020. And I think the intense gratitude that we all felt to healthcare workers at that moment surely found its way into the structure it's feeling in this chapter. And so let me turn to that. The nation's first dedicated AIDS ward was the result of a confluence of two factors: a budget surplus in the city of San Francisco and the dismal treatment that AIDS patients were receiving as they began to fill hospital beds across the city. Many arrived with pneumocystis pneumonia, and hospital staff were shocked when they had to put so many young men on ventilators. There were instances of blatant homophobia. One doctor, for example, who described the bronchoscopy he was about to perform as sticking a tube down this fag's throat. But more often, fear of infection distorted the care that hospital staff were able to give. Putting on a spacesuit before entering a patient's room, leaving food on a tray in the hallway, and avoiding interaction with patients. What began as periodic instances of inconvenience and disrespect, two nurses wrote, developed into a widespread breach of quality of care for people with AIDS. In the fall of 1982, a gay nurse named Cliff Morrison voiced his concerns to Marianne McGuire, the director of nursing, when they ran into each other in the hospital cafeteria at San Francisco General. McGuire raised the idea of an inpatient AIDS unit. Morrison was initially resistant to the idea, as were many others within the gay community, because a separate unit might become something akin to a leper colony. But Morrison soon came around. He himself was about to transfer from psychiatric nursing back to general medical, surgical nursing, and he asked McGuire, or rather he suggested to McGuire that she make him a clinical coordinator for AIDS care. McGuire took the proposal to hospital administrators, who were relieved to have someone willing to take on the crisis. They were also open to paying for things that in another context would never have flown, especially in a county hospital. Morrison was committed to primary nursing, the idea of an all RN staff in which a registered nurse provided all the care to a patient. There were no nursing assistants or licensed vocational nurses changing sheets or emptying bedpans. The primary nursing model provided a high quality of care, accountability, and continuity. Nurses would coordinate care and be responsible holistically for the needs of patients. It was very expensive, and yet the city said yes. In setting up the ward, Morrison was also able to arrange for a 1-to-4 ratio of nurses to patients, which was almost unheard of. Private rooms for patients were also critical to prevent cross-infection between patients who might have different opportunistic infections. Justified by a critically ill patient population with complex medical and psychosocial needs, the ward was, a nurse later reflected, nursing the way nursing was supposed to be. Remarkably, at a time when no one yet understood how the virus was transmitted, 40 nurses applied for 12 positions on the unit. Morrison looked for a mix of those who had experience in hospice and critical care, and those who had experience working in mental health. When McGuire looked at the staff Morrison had selected, she commented that he had chosen all the troublemakers in this system. He replied that he saw the strengths he was looking for. Roughly half were gay men, 1/4 were lesbians, and 1/4 were straight women, some of whom had formative ties to gay men and felt connected to gay culture. Morrison then asked the staff to make key decisions about how the work would be organized. They voted for a schedule, for example, in which 3 intense 12-hour days were followed by 4 days away to rest and recover. Ward 5B opened in July of 1980. Initially, the feeling on the job was oddly celebratory, almost like a party. For some of the gay nurses, it was the first time they had ever been truly open in their jobs. Hospitals in those days could be hypersexualized, almost incestuous work environments, with young men and women interns, residents, and nurses sharing an experience of trauma and suffering, close physical proximity. But that work culture, whether it was experienced as exciting or exploitative or something in between, tended to be heterosexually charged, which exacerbated the isolation of gay and lesbian nurses. One nurse remembered making up stories about what she did on the weekend when she worked at French Hospital in San Francisco. Another remembered the worry, given the interdependence of nurses, that if people knew you were gay, other nurses wouldn't be there for you. Others recalled quietly finding other gay nurses to eat lunch with, discreetly forming a secret affinity group. For most nurses, as for most professionals more generally, gay life was kept separate from work life, even though the liberationist ethos was beginning to erode this boundary. Now, on the AIDS ward, by contrast, work and your outside life, in the words of one nurse, were all one thing. The environment on the ward was not merely tolerant of gay culture, it celebrated it. One bisexual nurse noted that it was the straight part of her identity that was closeted at work because the norm was so clearly gay. In the early days especially, nurses were incredibly bonded with each other with an us against the world feeling. Imagine a group of young, mostly gay nurses being left alone by their hospital administration to create something totally unique in the country. There was the electricity of beginning something brand new, one nurse reflected. They were buoyed by the feeling that they were coming together to care for their community, and by the sense in the early days that AIDS would unfold like Legionnaire's disease and be quickly over. We can lick this thing, was the spirit on the ward. A unique culture on the ward was also shaped by its porousness. It was known as the ward without walls. From the beginning, the staff created policies that invited the community in. They immediately did away with visiting hours. For example, if a partner wanted to spend the night, we rolled in a cot, Nurse Steve Keith remembered, and said, come on. Long stays and private rooms meant that many patients made their rooms their own, bringing in crystal flower vases, champagne glasses, musical instruments, and boom boxes to enliven these spaces. At some point, someone donated a piano. The ward also encouraged support from the community more broadly. Some of those arrangements were formal, as with the Shanti Project, a social service organization that had been created in the 1970s to support people with life-threatening illnesses. Shanti counselors were on the ward from the beginning. More informal arrangements also developed over time, and certain individuals became fixtures. Rita Rocket, for example, a travel agent who had a history of partying with gay men before the epidemic, appeared every other Sunday to cater a brunch and tap dance for delighted patients. Cabaret singer Sharon McKnight came to perform Patsy Cline songs. Birthdays, weddings, and baptisms were celebrated on the ward. Even in the midst of the epidemic, there was a brightness to the gay community in the early 1980s, and some of that energy made its way onto the ward. Closest parallel in terms of communal expression of pride and identity was probably the ethnic hospital of the early 20th century. The communalism of the unit was also strengthened by the length of time that patients were on the ward. Early in the epidemic, admissions would sometimes last several weeks, and many AIDS patients were readmitted 3 or 4 times over the course of their illness. Because of the length of hospital stays, as well as the low nurse to patient ratio, nurses got to know their patients and sometimes even formed close relationships with them. It was always a good technical nurse, Susanna Keeley remembered, but the psychosocial aspects of her nursing practice grew and blossomed during her years on the ward. Total involvement with patients was a byproduct not only of a disease that had at that point a nearly 100% mortality rate, but also of the fact that many patients with AIDS lacked traditional support systems. Some were estranged from their families before they ever got sick. Others came out to their families only when forced to do so by their diagnosis, and many feared being rejected at the moment when support was desperately needed. Those layers of vulnerability deepened the bonds nurses formed with patients, and many of the traditional boundaries between nurses and patients were discarded. Physical touch became a central part of the care work and included nurses crawling into bed to hold distressed patients. Bill Barrett remembered getting into bed to embrace a crying patient and being with him for 5 or 10 minutes when a Shanti volunteer happened to walk by. I had 3 other patients I needed to take care of, and we exchanged hand signals, he remembered. I slipped out and she slipped in. It was incredibly finessed. Nurses also helped patients to navigate complex relationships with families, and they helped support distressed parents and siblings as they were learning all at once that their sons and brothers were gay and in all likelihood would soon be dead. Steve Keith got to know the brother and sister of a patient who had come to San Francisco for the first time and spent 5 days sitting on ward. He didn't want their full experience of the city to be a hospital room. So before their flight home, he loaded them in the car and showed them some of the fun parts of the city, describing this as the sort of thing you wouldn't normally do in a nursing job. As often, though, nurses would need to strike an adversarial tone with families of origin. An RN remembered putting himself physically between a patient's mother and his group of gay friends, whom she tried to order out of her son's room. No, nurse said, you don't have the authority to do that. Nurses sometimes protected patients from employers who called the ward looking for their employees. Nurses never gave out the identities of people on the ward for this reason, and the board showing admissions on the ward only used first names. Nurses might also put themselves between patient and doctor, explaining that the patients could refuse being poked and prodded when it wasn't going to change the trajectory of their illness. Nurses were more powerful in these contests than otherwise would have been the case, because AIDS was a nurse's disease that inverted the typical relationship between doctors and patients. We were the experts, or inverted the typical relationship between doctors and nurses, rather. We were the experts, not them, Marcy Fraser remembered. We would sit around and look at x-rays with doctors and say, what is this? But it was a nurse-run operation. Even when they were allies and partners with nurses, doctors had much less to offer patients suffering with the disease for which there was no treatment. It was the comfort and pain relief that nurses gave that mattered. There was always some risk to the job, perhaps not as much as nurses off the ward imagined, but perhaps more than the 5B nurses allowed for. Before it was really known that AIDS was not spread by casual contact, nurses on the ward were instinctively headed there. We were basically role modeling one way of relating to patients, Diane Jones remembered, which was to go in without precautions. In part, 5B nurses were reacting against what they viewed as the hysteria of nurses treating AIDS patients elsewhere who were taking extreme precautions in a way the 5B nurses found unnecessary and even homophobic. On the ward, nurses were adamant that we were going to prove to people that it was safe to take care of people with AIDS. There was an element of bravado or denial of this, and accidental needle sticks, which could transmit the virus, were often downplayed. When a test for antibodies to the virus was developed in 1985, it was a relief for nurses to know for certain if they had been infected. Nurses on 5B tested every few months, which took some anxiety out of the situation. But in 1987, one nurse on the ward had a needle stick and subsequently seroconverted. Nurses on the ward were stunned. The seroconversion ended up being the catalyst to rectify the excessively cavalier attitude that we've had on the call. More gloves were worn and recapping devices were designed to prevent needle sticks. The hardest part of the job, nurses found, was not managing anxiety about their own health, but rather the suffering and loss of patients. The work on 5B was messy nursing. Most of the nurses spoke at length about the nearly constant diarrhea that came with cryptosporidium, common opportunistic infection. You get a bed change, all fresh, and 5 minutes later, the patient puts his light on because it was full of diarrhea. Steve Keith remembered. Sometimes that would happen 5 times before things would settle down and you could breathe. Years later, when treatment involved suppressing viral loads and enhancing immune function such that people lived longer with the illness, AIDS deaths came to look more like cancer, heart failure, and other more standard deaths. Early AIDS deaths were as distinctive as they were brutal. Kaposi sarcoma was disfiguring and painful. Pneumocystis resulted in oxygen hunger, which was terrifying. One nurse cared for a man who died of Burkitt's lymphoma, a rare disease that before HIV had mostly been seen in Africa. This nurse literally watched her patient's tumors double during a 12-hour shift. She reached his family, and miraculously, they made it in time to be there with him as he died. She walked out of the room and saw another nurse. I fell into him and I just cried because it was over. Grief was interwoven into every workday. Nurses were all asked about their plan for self-care when they interviewed for the job, but in practice, people found what worked as they went along. Marcy Fraser remembered a kind of silliness and gallows humor on the ward that was sustaining. She worked the night shift, and there was always some quiet time when patients would be asleep and no one needed her. She and her colleague, Charles Cloninger, would practice ballroom dancing down the halls because we couldn't just be blue and new. For others, regular time away was the most critical for mental health. Kathleen O'Leary had an apartment on Clement Street in the Richmond district. It was a corner unit with a view of the ocean. The first day off, after several days on, I would just sit on the couch and look out the window. I had no energy for anything else. Another nurse had a habit of taking a book and spending the day at the Essential Bathhouse on Valencia Street. Others went out to the Russian River. Not all coping mechanisms were healthy. Drugs, sex, and alcohol, in moderation or to excess, helped to numb the intensity of the work week. Some 5B nurses socialized together a lot outside of work, others not at all. The one collective ritual they shared to process their grief was incredibly simple. They turned a donated scrapbook into what they called a necrology. In it, they wrote the name of every patient they cared for who died of AIDS, the room they died in, and the diagnosis: PCP, KS, cryptosporidium, cryptococcal meningitis. Over time, they began to add small details to better recall the dead as individuals. With brief notes written in haste, the necrology scrapbook grew to encompass pages and pages of names, with funny and poignant asides. Great mustache. Square dancer. Served vodka Collins in his room. quirky and robust till the end. Loving mom by his side. Kimono's wild flamboyance predicted his time. Heartbeat for 1¼ hours after he died. Kevin was the sweetest, exacting patient. Flamenco dance. Dear, sweet Jim. Elderly parents arrived just in time. Received VA on the day he died. Taught us all about dealing with pain. The divine duty. For most nurses, the job was not sustainable over the long term. They had different breaking points, saw different events as signs that it was time to go. For one nurse, it was a back injury that for her represented a spiritual as well as a physical break, or one too many needle sticks. The loss of a patient they had been especially close to, or the moment when ward nurses themselves began to get sick and die. In the early years alone, one woman nurse died of breast cancer and 2 male nurses died of AIDS. However long they stayed, most of them identified their time on the AIDS ward at San Francisco General as the best job of their working lives. This extremely rich environment, one nurse reflected, posed unavoidable questions. Questions about life and death, and sexuality and discrimination and drugs and addiction and family dynamics and pain and despair and hope and courage. Meaningful work. Comments or questions? We have time for that.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to read your work and to teach it. And really appreciate your balance for the kind of structure, but also the effect of flavor.
Thank you.
So, no, thank you. In thinking about doing all the world history, 150 of them, and really trying to capture and interpret this lot of human suffering and trauma. How did that feel for you as a historian, and then how were you able to help interviewees navigate in that process of sharing the stories with them?
Great question. So, I mean, first I'd say I love doing those interviews. I could have done that forever. I mean, I guess what I would say is a couple of things. One is, you know, I was talking to people, again, mostly folks who were born in the 30s and 40s. And I started doing interviews in 2011, and I did them all the way. I mean, I did my last one after I had completed a full draft in 2021. So over a 10-year span, although most of them at the beginning of the research process. And I guess, and so people were between, the people I was talking to at the time I was talking to were mostly between mid-70s and mid-80s. And I think, you know, I went into this thinking, I'm not sure people are going to be comfortable talking to me. I think we're people of that generation, I think many of them are eager to have their stories listened to and understood. I think because, you know, they think that, well, it's true, they lived through something that's so different from what the experience is now, and they want younger people in particular to understand it. So I think that was a very strong sense that many people had. I also think this is not something I think I really appreciated when I started, but, you know, I was asking people to tell me the story of their working lives. And I think it's really fascinating. People narrate their own identity and their sense of self through work. And I think that's true in working class jobs and in professional jobs. And so I think there was something about that that sort of helped people, gave people a sort of narrative to tell a story that was also about being gay or lesbian, or transgender. And so, you know, most of what I did as an interviewer was to say to people, tell me the story of your working lives. And generally people, and they knew what I was working on, and people would generally tell me about how their working lives intersected, connected with their lives as gay people. And then, you know, I also had sort of at the end of the interview things I would go back to if people hadn't talked about, that I asked most interviewees their experiences with unions in certain jobs, what they remembered about AIDS when it appeared on the work site, if they were married, how they thought about their and I mean married heterosexually, how they thought about that in relationship to their career trajectory, those kinds of things. And I guess I would say you know, one of the kind of biases that I tried to overcome, but I think it's probably never, we couldn't completely overcome it, is of course, people who were more interested in speaking to me were probably in a different place in terms of a sort of liberationist politics versus people who were more closeted, uncomfortable, which I thought was also a very important experience to capture among people I spoke to. And so I worked harder, I think, as time went on, to pursue people who weren't interested as interested in me, and the more interested people were, it's a little bit like dating. So you know, so that was something I got more savvy about as time went by. It's sort of like if people are reticent to talk to me, those are people I really want to figure out how to make them comfortable and feel safe talking to me, and figured out kind of various different ways to try and do that, mostly just with consent. And also I made, I should say this, I made anonymity a default condition of the study for exactly that reason. Some trade-off with that, because that of course involved, in a certain sense, recloseting, would not want to be recloseted and would want their name attached. But I just felt like if I didn't make anonymity to the condition for the people I interviewed kind of across the board, then I kind of felt like people who were reticent to talk to me would feel nervous that like I would forget that, you know, how I said I would handle their particular interview. So I just did that across the board, and that's, I think, like again a decision that has some trade-offs, but one I would probably make again. Sure. So I did that. I mean, I guess it's mostly snowball sampling, but I was interested to get people in kind of all different walks of life. And so when I started this project, at the very beginning, I was on a fellowship with the Radcliffe Institute, which is Harvard, and they have an enormous gay and lesbian alumni group. And the reading I had done in the social science literature, at least in the mid 20th century, suggested that as you went up the socioeconomic scale, people would be more covert. And so I thought that this was a good group to crack into. So they were very nice about letting me network with their alumni group. And so I started with that group, and of course, only representative of elite occupations. And then the next thing I did was sort of on the other end of the socioeconomic scale is there's a social service organization that started in New York. There are chapters that kind of around the country now called SAGE, which is services and advocates for gay elders, and they had a $2 drop-in dinner in Midtown, and they also had a center in Harlem, and they were wonderful about letting me come to those dinners and just talk to people about the research I was doing and see if people would be interested in talking to me. So that was another really nice group of interviews that was, again, sort of a different socioeconomic group than the one I started with at the Radcliffe. And from then it was just, you know, people knew about the research I was doing and they would say, you should talk to this person. So I did a really wonderful set of interviews with gay auto workers in Detroit and in Lansing. I did a set of interviews with blue collar lesbians in Houston. I did a set of interviews with lesbian deans of social work who vacation on Cape Cod. You know, so just like you know, just kind of, and then you know, I would generally wait till I had a sort of critical mass in a particular location and go and try and do that person. I think because of the age and also what I was talking about, I just thought those conversations would be better face to face. And so I did most of them that way. I did phone interviews and a few Zoom interviews in smaller cities and towns around the country. But that's sort of how I went about it. I mean, in retrospect, and if I were a social scientist rather than a historian, I might have had a different sensibility about being a little more systematic. Like I wanted to make sure I talked to people in you know, these various different occupations, and I want these regions of the country covered, and it was a little bit more I don't know, loosey-goosey than that. And I guess the other thing I would say about the interviews is again, while I did most of them very early in the research process, probably by, you know, I probably completed the bulk of them by maybe 2014. I kept doing them through the, you know, then I'd be in the archives and I'd find somebody in the archives and I think, well, I wonder if they're still alive, and then they would connect me to what they knew, and while I, you know, did fewer and fewer as time went on, every time I did them, including as I was really, you know, nearly putting the book into production, I just felt like they really kind of reconnected me to the kind of the beating heart of the project, and were sort of motivating to me and reminding me about a particular voice and experience that I wanted to capture. So yeah, I miss them. Sorry, I don't have to talk to people anymore about their working lives, but it was really very, I mean, it both, I think, guided the research and directed me towards the archives in a certain way, and I read archival evidence against those conversations and vice versa. But it also, I think, yeah, I think part of my writing process was really having those conversations as well.
Not just like the evidence, the arguments, the analysis, but also just like how you structured the book, how you wrote your own career experiences and the personal experiences into she, I thought, very daring and really fascinating, important. I had a question, like as somebody else was trying to historicize workers in the neoliberal era, you know, is there a danger that we prefigure neoliberalism too much and like overdetermine it a little bit? And I'm also thinking about, you know, Daniel Clark's work, for example, in Disrupting Detroit, I think pretty convincingly argues against the belief that even for, you know, straight cisgender males in working class occupations, that there was actually that stability. That stability was actually usually more of an ideal, like the whole breadwinner nuclear family was a lived experience for most working class people. that employers would and regularly did just lay off workers whenever they needed to, and rarely call them for shift changes, model changes, stuff like that. I guess what I'm wondering is, for the workers that you study, is a lesson that we should draw from it that historically employers will want as pliable and flexible a workforce as they can get away with in any economic conditions, regardless of other categories of identity.
I definitely think so, but I also think there is, I totally take your point about, the sort of maybe neoliberalism being over determined, but I do think there is also a real historical thing that happens with employers in terms of how they imagine employment relations and how they see the sort of the breadwinner and understand the breadwinner as part of a family unit, and versus an employment regime we've gone to where workers are all atomized. So in terms of I think this is a really interesting move in the historiography of kind of which Daniel Clark and I think of Gabe Monod's book and other people who are working on this question of like, well, was the mid-20th century really all that? Basically, for workers, and can we talk about precarity kind of all the does this go all the way back? And I think that's an interesting move, and certainly I think there's evidence for that we kind of romanticize. I mean, it's interesting because we used to say, well, the problem with this account is that it's all about kind of white male industrial workers, and it doesn't think about what the experience was for workers of color, and it doesn't think about women, and now we're like, well, it's kind of the account's wrong for white male industrial workers too. I think I'm sympathetic to that, but I also think, again, and partly it's just I'm kind of living in the current moment of like how impossible it is for not just working people, anybody to buy who's starting out to buy a house now, and how different that was from the mid-20th century, the GI Bill and all where people, there's this explosion of homeowning, and there is a kind of move into the middle class for people who didn't have that so there is something real there in terms of, and I don't think we totally want to lose that either. So it's just a question of nuancing it, probably. And neoliberalism, the whole question of like whether we should use that word, and again, I kind of think there's a there in terms of privatization and the taking apart of public sector goods and precarity that is, again, not just about the working class, but kind of goes all the way up this class structure. Think about what's happening to higher education, all of it. So I think there is a thing there that needs to work. And neoliberalism seems to me as good as any other we could come up with. So I'm kind of an advocate for name, problems need names, I guess I would say. Yeah. That's all.
This, we're hoping to add a little more about the convention. Your work is so clarifying around the ways that theory of gay labor is like an emergent body for this that sort of is what we take correct point that your pursue a career that we all yeah. And the sort of tension that you have in your final example of hospital workers, profound despair, but also this amazing queer world making at the same time. I think that what you're describing is this sort of a history of capitalism at both this hellscape and opportunities for affective world making in ways that aren't anticipated by the dump of, say, the government philosophy. And but yet somehow in some small pockets, profound worlds are transformed in those moments. And so just to talk a little bit about that active dimension of work. You mentioned it earlier, and you talked about a person who wanted to be a typist. And in your book, you mentioned that what might be missing from just reporting the person who wanted to be a typist was sort of affective relationship to the gendered world of typist as a profession and all of this sort of dynamic, that possibility to be a typist, to have all kinds of implications for that person. And at the same time, the folks you were describing the hospital, while also transforming the world that they haven't also have in their life. And so, can you sort of talk a little bit more about the ways in which sort of affective dimension of your work might be a register, not only obviously you mentioned that women do have, usually Black women do have work, but the ways in which there might be specificity to queer labor that may have an affective dimension to it, that has a sort of contribution that one needs to have like a basic economic job, private sphere, because that's the only space that will have unemployment within the profession, and at the same time also is below their rank and skill sets. And in other places like typist, that's an opportunity to, or the other person who looks for a low paying job where they employment also like make and be yourself and also a site because of that precarious labor and mode of labor that's especially exploited.
Yeah, I don't know if I can say it better than you just said it, but I mean, I think, you know, there's something in terms of kind of the affective dimension of work. You know, I think, and thinking about sort of gay people in their jobs. I mean, I think there's something both universal and particular in the sense that I think, you know, work is an effective space for everyone. It is, you know, very much connected to identity and meaning for all of us. And yet I think there are particular ways in which it has meaning for gay people in this period. And in some ways, you know, and this is maybe the note I started on, is that LGBT historians, I think, have spent a lot of time, and for obvious reasons, thinking about the workplace as a straight space and something that was a place that was merely repressive, and where not a place where gay life happened. Gay life happened at the bar and street. That's where gay culture was created, and people, you know, the notion that like people kind of took off their gayness to go to the job, got through their 8 hours, and then went back and had their gay life. And I think the historiography has done that. It has sort of mirrored that notion to a large extent, not completely, but you know, I think once you get into it, there are all sorts of ways in which, as I like the expression you use, that there's sort of queer world making on the job in all kinds of different jobs. I mean, certainly people found other gay people at work, and in some ways it's particularly important for lesbians who had the you know, the bars could be a little harder to find for women. Like the sort of lesbian culture was less elaborated, so that the sort of noting, you know, the secretary next to you, you know, what she was reading or whatever kind of triggered a conversation that connected you to a gay world outside life or outside work. That's an important story. I also think there's a really fascinating story, and it's one I don't elaborate on enough in my book, and I think probably deserves a whole other study, just about jobs and gender and the way, you know, that particularly at mid-century, but really I think this is a phenomenon through much of the 20th century, that jobs can affirm, work is a place that can affirm gender that wouldn't be culturally available somewhere else. And I think, you know, particularly butch lesbians in the 1950s who, you know, are driving motorcycles and wearing men's clothes to their jobs in the factories, and those jobs mean everything to them. That, you know, those jobs are like part of who they are in the world and hold them up. And the same thing with this typist, like that, you know, it's not that he was good at typing and I mean, he was good at typing and that was nice too, but it was more than that. It's like being a typist was part of who he was as a gendered person. And that was affirmation he could get a job that he's not going to get in a lot of other places. So, so I think there's just many, many layers to it. But I think, you know, career world making is a wonderful way to think about it. And of course, happening more in some jobs than others, but even in jobs that we think of as very, very straight, you know, there is, I think, quietly a world making happening can be in those jobs as well.
We'd like to thank Margot for wonderful talk. We have room for at least a half an hour. We have some food and refreshments. Please hang around, talk to each other, say hello to our speaker. But thank you.